Again, today is going to be all about how do we take SwiftUI and integrate it what we've already learned about with storyboards. And there's a lot of power inside of SwiftUI, but it's got a bunch of gaps and a bunch of holes, and it's not incredibly built out yet. I mean, it's brand new. Apple released it 10 months ago or so. And so it's not totally ready for prime time. So most projects are going to require a combination of all the stuff we've learned up until this point and SwiftUI. And there's a couple different ways we can integrate these two. One, which we're not going to get to today, is worth knowing exists, which is we can take an existing storyboard view controller and put SwiftUI view into it. So a little window into SwiftUI within the larger application, which is pretty cool. It's a little complicated to do that, so we're going to do something a little bit simpler and more common, which is just like you have an entire view controller, an entire page, an entire screen that's being controlled by storyboards like we've done up until this point. You can have a link from that through a button or whatever to an entirely new screen, an entirely new view controller that's just SwiftUI. And so you can mash, kind of hybridize inside of your app where you have a whole set of screens that are normal storyboard-based screens, and then you have one or two screens that are setting screens or something like that that are SwiftUI. And so let's get into that, and I'm going to show you how to do that. So to do it, just go into Xcode, go New, Project. Move this so that you all can see it. Again, I'm recording a little bit smaller today so that hopefully all the interface elements are larger for you on YouTube. Hopefully this makes things a little bit easier for you. If it's not, let me know and I'll keep on experimenting. So give it a project, whatever you want to call it, but the important thing here on this screen is that you're making sure that user interface is set to storyboard, not SwiftUI. So the idea here is that kind of our base level of how we're going to be working is how we've been working the entire semester up until SwiftUI. And so that's storyboards. Create. And so now we have our project. I'm going to hide some things so you can see it a little bit easier, but I have just a standard view controller, single view app, no big deal. I'm going to take this single view app and I'm going to embed it in a navigation controller so that I can move off of this screen into SwiftUI and then have that navigation bar across the top that says back that jumps me back into this page. So I select the view controller, I go editor, embed in navigation controller. Again, standard stuff, nothing new. I'm going to have a button that goes off of this view controller into a new view controller, and this new view controller is going to be controlled by SwiftUI. And so I'm going to add that, and there's a new type of view controller that now that SwiftUI is rolled out called a hosting view controller. A hosting view controller hosts SwiftUI inside of it. Now the downside of this method is you won't get that nice little preview thing that you got with SwiftUI, but you can still compile and it'll still work just like before. So this is my hosting view controller, and it's going to do what it says in the tin. It's going to host my SwiftUI elements, and so it's going to be the thing that holds all the other stuff. So we'll get to that in a second. So to make it hold that stuff. So to make this work, I'm going to have a button that goes from here to here. And to make it pretty, I'm going to give this button descriptor. That's a really long name for a button, but you'll get the idea. And then I'm going to compile it. Oh wait, I need to connect the two. This is kind of stupid to just compile at this point. So I'm going to control drag, just like I was making a normal segue from this button over to my hosting view controller. And this is important. I want to make sure that the action that I set is show. And let's compile it. I'll bring it over to show you my little preview iPhone. And it shows my hosting view controller. Perfect. Very exciting. All right. So now that I have that, you can see the hosting view controller is empty, it has nothing. I need now to connect my hosting view controller with SwiftUI. So let's do that. there's a little trick that I haven't talked to you about yet in this semester, and that is you can make your navigator, or your editor rather, have assistant mode, which will split the screen. And whatever view controller you have selected, so here I've selected this one, it'll automatically load up the Swift code that's associated with that on the side. I think it's a little useful and a little helpful. Hopefully you do too. So man, it's hard to work on this little teeny screen. But I'm now looking at the view controller that controls the first element in my storyboard. I'm going to go out of this split screen view because it's just bonkers at this small size. So I'm going to look at the view controller that controls this screen. It's the one that it came with right there. And it's just a standard view controller. Only the new thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add to the top the ability to do some SwiftUI stuff. So instead of just importing UIKit, which means this is just a UIKit page, I'm also going to say it's not just UIKit, it's also SwiftUI. And so now I can put some SwiftUI elements into this view controller. So that's what I'm going to do with it to modify this view controller at this point. What I'm also going to do is now add a SwiftUI file. And the SwiftUI file is just like all the other SwiftUI files that we've done. And so to do that, I'm just going to go File, New, File. And I'm going to make sure that SwiftUI view is selected here. You can give it whatever name you want. I'm going to give it the default SwiftUI view because it's descriptive. And I have my standard SwiftUI view right here. And you can see, even when I'm just looking at SwiftUI view, I do get the little preview thing, which is convenient and nice. So I have my SwiftUI view, and it exists. You can tell it says "Hello World" inside of a fake iPhone. Awesome. Everything is working. All right, so now I'm going to go back to my view controller, which is the main view controller, and I'm going to switch back into my normal view and look at my storyboard. Now, up until this point, we haven't done much with segues other than we pass data between views with them. However, segues can do something a little bit more interesting. What this is going to do is I'm going to make this segue force this hosting view controller essentially to load into this view controller. And what that will do is enable me to display SwiftUI stuff inside of a view controller. So this hosting controller is going to host the SwiftUI controller through the segue. And to do that, I need to control the segue. And we looked at a couple different ways of controlling the segue, like the prepare for stuff. But there's also a way to control segues, which we haven't looked at, which is to connect them using IB outlets. In the same way that we connect buttons to Swift code or labels to Swift code, we can connect segues to Swift code. And so to do that, I need to split screen it. So I need to be able to see my Swift code on one side and my storyboard on the other side. I could do that by hitting a little plus, or I'm going to use our new trick, the assistant, to see both at the same time. I'm going to hide this so I have a little bit more room. Really running a little in real estate here. But so here's my old school view controller. Here's my segue, and here's my new SwiftUI. What I'm going to do is select my segue, scroll down in my view controller, my old school view controller, and control drag off and insert an action here. And this segue action is through which we're going to pass the UI view controller stuff. And so I'm going to give this a name that makes sense. I'll call it like Show Swift UI. Hit connect. And you can see it populates a lot of stuff automatically because it's basically guessing at what I want to do. It's seeing that I want to make it return the hosting view controller. The important thing is now I just need to tell it which SwiftUI view I want to show it. So if I switch back over to my SwiftUI view, you can see that my SwiftUI view is named SwiftUI view. That's convenient. So I'm going to copy that name, go back to my view controller, and right here where it says root view, it's basically saying which one of those SwiftUI views that could, of infinite possibilities you could have, which one do you want to show? I'm going to say, I don't want to show the ... one. I want to show this one. And this is the important thing. I can't just say give it a name. I have to give it its function so that it'll run it. And so now when I run this, I have a button, and it shows my SwiftUI. Awesome. This is super cool. So let's build this out a little bit. How can we pass information between the two? Because right now, they're totally dummies. And the old way we would pass information is through a segue, or by saving to user defaults and having one screen load the user defaults up in the other screen. We can still do that. You can still integrate user defaults with SwiftUI, which we'll get to in a second. But another way of doing it is through this right here. Through this segue action, I can pass some information into SwiftUI view. So let's go ahead and set that up. So we haven't really deconstructed how SwiftUI view works, but basically this is the preview version of SwiftUI, that little fake iPhone that you can display inside of Xcode. But it works in the same way that everything else is going to ever load my SwiftUI view into the screen. And that's what it does here, is it runs SwiftUI view in the same way that I ran it through the segue. So this right here is saying execute this. And you can see it looks very similar to everything else, only it has these little parentheses, just like every method and function does. And that method or function right there, that little parentheses, works the exact same way that like this one does, where I can pass things into it through these parentheses. And so let's say, for instance, I wanted to have a variable here. And this variable that I'm going to use inside of SwiftUI view has to be populated by something outside of it. So I'm going to say here, up outside of the body, there exists a variable, and I'll call it text to display. And I'm going to say it is a string. I'm not going to define it. I'm just going to say it is a string. And so now every time that I load SwiftUI view, I have to define what text to display is. So for instance, down here in the preview version, I can say text to display is, this is the preview. And so now if in my editor, I go ahead and view the canvas, which lets me see the little fake iPhone running inside of this. Oh, it didn't like something. Oh. It didn't like the fact that I haven't used that in the other thing yet. So we'll get to that in a second. Okay, so I'll turn that off. Let's now tie all these things together. So I have text to display, and I can say, don't display this as a preview, display text to display. And so now, when these things all work together, what's my error? Okay, cool. When these things work together, what would happen if I was working outside of, if I didn't have this error message, which I'll explain in a second. What would happen is when SwiftUI view is shown inside of the preview, which is inside of Xcode, this is the preview, goes into this variable, and so the text would display, the text that would be displayed would say, this is the preview. Now let's make it so that I can change text to display through my first view controller. Where you can see right here, I have SwiftUI view gets called in the same way that it did in the preview, only now you can see it's missing something, which is it needs to know what text to display is. So I'll hit fix, and I can give it any string that I want. So here I'll say coming from normal view controller. Okay. So now what this is going to just do is display from a normal view controller, which we'll look at that in a second. But let's go back to our SwiftUI view so you can see how this works. So this is the preview. If I look at through the canvas mode, which is the one that lets me see a little mini iPhone inside of Xcode, you can see that inside of this little thing, it says this is the preview. However, if I run it inside of my iPhone, my real deal iPhone over here, well, my fake real deal iPhone, if I'm coming to that same page from a normal view controller, it now says something totally different. And again, how that's working is that text is being populated. Hold on. That text was being populated right here. And so what's cool about that is that you can make this SwiftUI action segue, you can modify it in any way. So you could have whatever the index of the thing is that they tapped from a list go into that, be passed through that. Or you could have it keep track of they clicked on Pikachu or whatever, and then do different behavior inside of that next SwiftUI view. So on our next video, we'll take a look at how to integrate those two things, how to use this fact that we can pass data between these two different things, so we can kind of have a real deal app where we have a handful of components that are happening in one place and a handful of components that are happening in another.